In less than 1 year, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has achieved his mission of taking back the mines which had signed ridiculous agreements with previous government of Burkina Faso.
Burkina Faso just did what the world said Africa couldn't. It turned gold into power. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the nation has earned $18 billion in gold revenue since 2022, not through charity or loans, but through ownership. 5 foreign mines reclaimed. A new mining code has been written. For once, the gold stayed where it was dug. What the West calls resource nationalism, Africans call economic justice. The moment a nation decides to keep what was already its own. And can the West really do anything about it? Let's find out. It started as a quiet announcement, buried in economic reports. Then the numbers hit $18 billion in gold revenue since 2022. The world blinked. Burkina Faso, a country long dismissed as one of Africa's poorest, had just produced one of the richest success stories in modern African history. But this wasn't luck. It wasn't the market. It was leadership, strategy, and something the West didn't expect. A government that finally said, enough. For decades, gold was Burkina Faso's curse. The metal that could have built empires instead built dependency. Multinational corporations, operating under old colonial-style contracts, drained the mines and left behind dust. The profit trail ran from the Sahel to Switzerland, from Ouagadougou to offshore accounts. Local miners were paid in survival, while the world traded fortunes on gold extracted from their soil. That model worked, but only for those who designed it. Then came Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier turned statesman who understood that independence without ownership was theater. When he took power in 2022, he inherited an economy shaped by others, IMF advisors, Western investors, and corporate boards that dictated policy from continents away. Burkina Faso's gold industry was a skeleton wearing someone else's skin. Traoré didn't just want to reform it, he wanted to reclaim it. The result? Within 3 years, Burkina Faso turned its greatest vulnerability into its greatest weapon. Those $18 billion weren't just revenue, they were proof that Africa could fund itself. 5 foreign-operated mines were taken under national control. A new mining code gave the state majority stakes in future projects. And for the first time, profits from Burkina Faso's gold flowed not to London or Toronto, but into the Burkinabe treasury. What made this different wasn't just the money, it was the message. The world has always measured Africa's strength in minerals, but Traoré flipped the equation. He began to measure it in control. Under his administration, gold wasn't a commodity. It was a currency of sovereignty. This shift was more than policy. It was a psychological correction. For too long, African nations were told to be grateful for investment, while their wealth financed the very powers that lectured them on poverty. Western economists called it resource nationalism, a coded term for when Africans stopped being predictable. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, it had another name: freedom paid in full. Markets may have panicked, but citizens didn't. They saw something new, a state that no longer bowed to foreign audit reports, one that finally understood that the road to sovereignty doesn't begin with diplomacy. It begins with revenue discipline, and the timing couldn't have been more significant. Across Africa, countries are tired of the paradox: rich lands, poor people. The Burkinabe example shattered the illusion that foreign capital is the only route to development. Here was a landlocked nation, surrounded by challenges, choosing to rewrite its future through law, not charity. It was a rare political experiment that actually worked, and it exposed how much of Africa's weakness had been artificially maintained through bad contracts, not bad luck. That's why this moment is more than a domestic victory. It's a continental signal. Because when one African country proves that ownership is possible, every other African leader faces a question they can no longer dodge. What's your excuse? Traoré's numbers made that question unavoidable. $18 billion wasn't a statistic, it was a mirror. Still, numbers alone don't explain the story. This didn't happen because gold became more valuable. It happened because the Burkinabe government redefined what value meant. The story behind this transformation, how Traoré dismantled the system that kept his country poor and turned its most exploited sector into a fortress of sovereignty, is what separates this event from every reform before it. Because it wasn't just a financial decision, it was a declaration of independence in a new language, the language of profit. And to understand how he pulled it off, we need to go inside Traoré's thinking. the mindset that turned a military captain into an architect of economic freedom. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré looked at Burkina Faso's gold industry, he didn't see an economy. He saw a trap. Every ounce that left the soil represented two things: the poverty of his people and the profit of someone else's empire. To him, the crisis wasn't corruption, it was architecture. The system was designed to make Burkina Faso rich on paper but poor in practice. And if that system was designed, then it could be redesigned. That's exactly what he did. Traoré's philosophy of economic power begins with a soldier's logic: control the supply lines or you lose the war. He realized that gold wasn't just a mineral. It was the lifeline that funded everything from national stability to foreign interference. The old contracts written decades ago were full of legal chains, tax exemptions, export loopholes, and inflated operational costs that allowed corporations to claim losses while exporting billions. Even the so-called partnerships with international firms were traps disguised as cooperation. Burkinabe officials signed on dotted lines that ensured the country received crumbs from its own table. Traoré's first step was to audit everything. He ordered a comprehensive review of all active mining agreements, a move that sent shockwaves through corporate circles. What those audits revealed was staggering: underreporting of production volumes, false accounting on exploration expenses, and the consistent use of offshore intermediaries to avoid local taxation. In short, Burkina Faso had been robbed in broad daylight, with paperwork as the weapon. But Traoré wasn't interested in courtroom battles or diplomatic outrage. He wanted permanent leverage, so he changed the law. The new mining code, enacted under his leadership, gave the state majority participation rights in all future mining ventures. No more token royalties or advisory roles. The Burkinabe government became a shareholder. The code also introduced two radical principles that redefined how ownership worked in Africa: the right to intervene, which means the state could suspend or revoke licenses of companies violating transparency laws without prior approval from foreign courts, and the obligation to reinvest. A fixed percentage of mining profits had to be reinvested directly into local industries and communities instead of being wired overseas. This wasn't ideology, it was arithmetic justice. Traoré was building a feedback loop, an economic ecosystem that finally allowed national wealth to circulate within national borders. His policy advisors called it sovereign circulation. Western analysts called it reckless. But while they debated theory, Ouagadougou was watching the numbers move in real time. Traoré knew the risks. There were warnings from international investors, murmurs about sanctions, even quiet calls from Western embassies urging restraint. Yet, he remained unmoved. He understood something the old elites never did: that real instability doesn't come from scaring investors, it comes from starving citizens. And the surest way to prevent rebellion is to let your people benefit from their nation's abundance. His leadership wasn't charismatic, it was calculated. He doesn't talk in slogans, he speaks in outcomes. When foreign advisors warned that nationalizing assets would isolate Burkina Faso, he responded with a question that has since become famous in Ouagadougou's political circles. If our independence isolates us, what exactly were we connected to before? It was a quiet rebuke, but it captured everything about his governing style: defiance, reason, and vision. Traoré didn't just oppose dependency, he outgrew it. But the brilliance of his approach lies in something deeper. He wasn't only reclaiming gold, he was redefining trust. For decades, African citizens have been told to trust international investors over their own governments. Traoré flipped that narrative. He made the state itself a participant in the economy rather than a referee watching from the sidelines. It's a subtle but revolutionary shift. When citizens see their government directly involved in production and profit sharing, patriotism stops being rhetoric and starts becoming math. And that's why Burkina Faso's gold transformation didn't just stay within its borders. It became a case study for neighboring nations struggling with the same invisible chains. Because once you expose how dependence is engineered, the next step becomes inevitable: collective resistance. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When Burkina Faso redrew the blueprint of ownership, it did more than rewrite its own fate. It cracked the psychological ceiling that kept an entire region obedient. Across the Sahel, governments that once watched from the sidelines suddenly began to ask dangerous questions. If Burkina Faso can do it, why can't we? That single thought, small but revolutionary, began to spread faster than any military alliance ever could. The first to act was Mali. For years, its gold sector operated under the same colonial relics that once trapped Burkina Faso: foreign-controlled, undertaxed, and over-extracted. But after Traoré's reforms, Bamako's parliament passed a series of legal measures that mirrored Ouagadougou's approach: higher state equity in mines, stricter export controls, and the creation of a sovereign mining fund designed to keep profits within national reach. It was no coincidence. The two countries, long bound by geography and struggle, were now bound by philosophy: the belief that sovereignty is worthless without economic self-determination. Soon after, Niger joined the momentum. Fresh from its own political reawakening, Niamey turned its focus toward uranium, the mineral that had powered France's nuclear ambitions for decades while leaving Niger's villages in the dark. Inspired by Traoré's stance, the Nigerian government began renegotiating its contracts with the French energy giant Orano. For the first time in history, Niger demanded transparency on export quantities and price declarations. The West called it provocation. The Sahel called it balance. This alignment wasn't orchestrated in boardrooms or under diplomatic chandeliers. It happened quietly, through shared frustration, through the recognition that every Sahelian country was fighting the same invisible enemy: a global system where Africa supplied the raw and imported the refined. Burkina Faso's defiance served as proof that this system was not destiny but design, and design can be changed. That realization gave birth to something the West hadn't predicted: the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. More than a political bloc, AES became a statement of intent. It symbolized the region's shift from dependency to self-direction. The alliance members, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, began coordinating not only security and defense, but also resource management, export policy, and financial sovereignty. Together, they envisioned a model of economic cooperation unmediated by Western institutions. No World Bank intermediaries, no IMF conditions, just African nations talking to each other like equals. This was the real revolution, not a coup of generals, but a coup of logic. The Sahel realized that strength doesn't come from alignment with global powers, but from alignment with one's own interests. Burkina Faso had shown that you could lose Western applause and still win national progress. Mali saw that you could reject French troops and still secure your borders. Niger understood that rejecting unfair contracts didn't isolate you. It introduced you to partners who respected you. As the Sahel's vision grew clearer, so did the West's discomfort. Analysts warned of economic instability. Investors hesitated. Aid programs were reviewed. But beneath the diplomatic language was a simple fear: the fear that Africa's most dismissed region had discovered its formula for autonomy. AES was no longer just a political bloc. It was an economic firewall, a collective decision to insulate regional wealth from external manipulation. And yet, the alliance didn't stop at gold or uranium. It began talking about agriculture, energy, and industrial manufacturing. If Burkina Faso could mine and refine gold, why couldn't the Sahel refine its oil, process its cotton, and produce its fertilizers? The logic was unstoppable once stated aloud. The Sahel's awakening was not born out of hatred for the West, it was born out of exhaustion, the exhaustion of begging for loans to access one's own wealth. Traoré's model had shown a path out, not through rebellion, but through recalibration. The Sahel no longer wanted to be managed. It wanted to manage itself. And as this awakening spread, one truth became impossible to ignore: national sovereignty means nothing if it ends at the border. The Sahel understood that freedom has to be regional, not rhetorical. Because when one nation reclaims its wealth, it becomes a headline. But when three nations do it together, it becomes a movement. Still, every movement faces its ultimate test. Can it transform resistance into construction? Can the fire of revolution sustain itself long enough to build industries, jobs, and systems that last? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Once the Sahel learned to say no, Burkina Faso learned to ask the harder question: what comes after rejection? Reclaiming resources was victory. Transforming them was survival. Traoré knew revolutions collapse when they stop at symbolism. The next phase had to prove that sovereignty wasn't just about controlling what came out of the ground, but about controlling what came after. And that meant breaking the oldest curse of Africa's economy: exporting raw, importing refined. Gold was the test case. For decades, Burkina Faso shipped its minerals out in raw form, earning a fraction of their value while foreign refineries and banks reaped the reward. Traoré understood that nationalization without industrialization was just a louder version of dependency. So he turned the $18 billion momentum into infrastructure, refineries, factories, and energy projects designed to keep value inside national borders. At the heart of this transformation is the construction of Burkina Faso's first national gold refinery, a facility capable of processing 400 kilograms of gold per day. More than a technical milestone, it is an economic firewall, a structure designed to end the quiet theft that occurs when African gold is valued abroad. By refining domestically, Burkina Faso dictates the price, the process, and the profit. What was once a commodity extracted and exported is now a domestic product with political weight. But Traoré's vision didn't end with gold. He saw the mining boom as a foundation for horizontal development, industries feeding other industries. Using gold revenue, his government began investing heavily in agro-processing and energy generation. A new tomato processing factory in Bobo Dioulasso, built with state-backed capital, now turns local harvests into exportable goods, replacing imports from Europe. The same logic was applied to Burkina Faso's growing rice and cotton sectors. Process locally, profit nationally. Energy, too, became a strategic priority. The gold-funded solar and hydroelectric projects in Ziga, Lumbila, and Bagre are not just lighting homes. They're powering the factories that will define the next generation of Burkinabe industry. For Traoré, energy independence is the foundation of economic freedom, because a nation that must beg for electricity will eventually beg for everything else. What makes this phase remarkable is its self-financing nature. Burkina Faso didn't borrow from the IMF to build its refinery. It didn't take World Bank loans for its industrial parks. The state funded these projects from its own gold revenue, demonstrating something that terrifies lenders, that development is possible without debt. This shift from borrowing to building has created a new national mindset, one that measures progress not by foreign approval, but by internal production. And it's working. The Burkinabe economy, once fragile and export-dependent, is diversifying. Small industrial zones have emerged around Ouagadougou and Koudougou, specializing in local manufacturing, agricultural storage, and mineral refining. Employment is rising, and so is national pride. For the first time in living memory, Burkinabe workers are not just extracting wealth, they're transforming it. Even more symbolic is the government's decision to link these industries with regional trade corridors under the Alliance of Sahel States AES. Plans are underway to connect Burkina Faso's industrial output with Mali's transport routes and Niger's energy grid. This is the invisible side of the gold story, the birth of infrastructure diplomacy. Instead of waiting for aid-funded highways, these nations are building trade routes that serve their industries, not foreign interests. Critics once said the Sahel couldn't industrialize without Western capital. But the reality unfolding in Ouagadougou tells a different story. Capital was never the problem, control was. Once Burkina Faso took control of its resources, the money appeared where it always should have been, at home. The refinery, the factories, the solar grids, they're not miracles, they're math. And yet, as Burkina Faso's factories hum and its mines flourish under national ownership, one question looms larger than all. Can this model endure global pressure? The factories are running, the refineries are humming, and the numbers no longer lie. Burkina Faso has not only rebuilt its economy, but redefined the very meaning of sovereignty. Yet, as the machinery of progress accelerates, Traoré faces the deeper challenge: protecting this model from the same global forces that once buried it. Because when a nation shifts from dependency to self-determination, it doesn't just change its economy, it threatens an order built on control. That is the unspoken reality behind Burkina Faso's gold revolution. It's not just a financial success, it's a philosophical rupture in how the world expects Africa to behave. For centuries, Africa's role in the global economy was scripted: extract, export, and obey. Now Traoré is tearing up that script. His government's message is simple yet revolutionary. Africa will no longer trade wealth for permission. The $18 billion in gold revenue isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new moral and economic code. It represents the first time in decades that an African state has chosen to grow without external debt, refusing to mortgage its minerals to the same institutions that profit from its poverty. In doing so, Burkina Faso has exposed an uncomfortable truth about international finance: that aid and loans are not acts of generosity, but instruments of control. The West isn't angry because Burkina Faso nationalized mines, it's angry because it nationalized confidence. Across the continent, this confidence is spreading. From Tanzania's resource reforms to Zimbabwe's lithium policies and Ghana's domestic gold purchase program, African governments are studying what Traoré achieved. They're learning that sovereignty is not won in wars or summits, but in balance sheets. Economic independence is no longer a dream. It's a discipline, a system of numbers that refuses to bow. And the proof is in the transformation of people, not just policies. In Ouagadougou, miners who once earned survival wages now see tangible returns through state-backed cooperatives. Farmers are accessing fertilizers produced locally instead of being imported from Europe. The National Army, once reliant on foreign logistics, is now funded by domestic gold revenue. Even the currency debate has shifted. Discussions about creating a Sahelian monetary framework are gaining momentum under the Alliance of Sahel States. For the first time, the region is exploring the idea of backing its own currency with its own minerals, a concept that could completely rewrite Africa's place in the global financial hierarchy. But this shift is more than economic. It's psychological decolonization. Traoré's leadership has challenged the most damaging myth of all, that Africans cannot govern complexity. The West's long-standing narrative was that African economies needed guidance, that without international oversight, chaos would follow. Yet the Burkina Faso experiment has done what decades of aid couldn't. It delivered results. The country's GDP has stabilized, revenue retention has surged, and more importantly, the idea of self-management no longer feels radical. It feels natural. Still, Traoré's journey is not without resistance. Global markets remain skeptical, and Western media continue to frame his leadership as militarized populism. But beneath the criticism lies fear. Fear that if Burkina Faso succeeds, others will follow. Because what he's built is not a local miracle. It's a regional contagion of confidence. The Sahel, once described as a geopolitical wasteland, is quietly becoming a workshop of independence. Its leaders speak of refineries instead of bases, trade corridors instead of airstrikes. This is what frightens global institutions most, an Africa that's finally learning to say no, not out of anger, but out of competence. Burkina Faso's gold is no longer just metal, it's a currency of dignity. It's financing the rebirth of a nation that refused to stay broken. Every factory, every refinery, every worker's paycheck tells the same story. That ownership works, that independence pays, and that sovereignty is measurable. The implications go far beyond the Sahel. If one nation can break the debt chain and build its own industries, others will follow. And when they do, the world's old economic order, one that depends on Africa's compliance, will face a reckoning. Because the real treasure Burkina Faso discovered wasn't under the ground, it was in the realization that true wealth begins when a nation stops asking for permission to exist. Will Africa's future be built by those who own its soil, or by those who still sell it? Let us know in the comments section how long before the rest of the continent follows Burkina Faso's lead. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: